So this week's topic, week 5, is regarding how firms organize themselves and behave in the marketplace. And so if we look at kind of the three main ways that firms are organized in an economy, it can be either a monopoly, some type of competitive nature, and then an oligopoly. And so we'll look at monopolies first and discuss just briefly why monopolies, generally speaking, don't work and are not an advantageous way to organize yourself in an economy because of the behavior of the firm. Firms behave differently due to the laws of supply and demand in a monopoly because the lack of competition destroys the benefits of the laws of supply and demand, which of course set price in a competitive environment where the buyers and the sellers find some type of equilibrium. And when we don't have competition, in other words, a monopoly, that industry recognizes the nature of supply and demand and leverages it to their advantage and profitability. So therefore, in monopolies, quality typically is going to be reduced and the price is going to be increased. Why? Because they can, and they can still make money due to the lack of competition. So any economies that have tried or at least allowed monopolies to exist found and find that it is to the detriment of the whole of society, and the costs, externalities on the welfare side are great. In other words, the lack of quality and the increase in price is certainly damaging, not only in the short term, but in the long run, if they're allowed to exist. Of course, in the United States, early on, the policymakers recognized the negatives, the futility of and the damage that monopolies do, not only to industries, but those that it serves, by setting up antitrust laws, specifically the Sherman Antitrust Law or Sherman Antitrust Act. And as it's moved forward, of course, it's had a number of different iterations, but generally speaking, the United States has recognized how monopolies can be damaging to its individual citizens and the industries by crowding out the positive effects of the laws of supply and demand and a competitive nature. So if we were to look then at, and that's one extreme, is pure monopolies. If we look at the other extreme, at pure competition, which doesn't exist in our economy, we have something that's called monopolistic competition. But we look at pure competition, where prices are going to be cited purely on the laws of supply and demand without any intervention in the markets. That in theory is something that is very advantageous, but in practice is almost an impossibility. There are few economies that operate under pure competition, and so therefore we'll set that aside because the behavior really is irrelevant to the discussion because it just simply doesn't exist. In the United States, we have this monopolistic competition where we have many buyers and sellers of similar products with substitutes. And because of that, then each brand or each company tries to differentiate itself in the marketplace, which of course then affect the laws of supply and demand and equilibrium price. And in setting the price by the laws of supply and demand and monopolistic competition, companies are required then to differentiate themselves through brand and by telling people about that through advertising, which of course then does increase the price. And that would be the downside of monopolistic competition relative to pure competition, where you wouldn't have to advertise. And that extra cost, depending upon your industry, could be up to 20% of the price. Yet the argument is because of the competitive nature in monopolistic competition and differentiation, people are getting better products at better prices, even with the increased cost of advertising, which you could argue is a sunk cost, and that sunk cost is something that you won't recapture whether you sell 1 or 100 or 1,000 units. It's a fixed cost, and many companies operate under the budget of advertising being a fixed and or a sunk cost. In addition, our economy allows something called, and can be organized, industries can be organized around something called an oligopoly. And an oligopoly is where we don't have pure competition. It's not a pure monopoly. It's somewhere kind of around this monopolistic competition, but there are not many buyers and sellers. There are few sellers, and probably in many cases many buyers, but there's few. So there's a barrier to entry, such as, you can argue that the soft drink industry is an oligopoly. It'd be very difficult for someone to go nationally and compete against Pepsi or Coke. Those two, by and large, run the industry, set the prices, and many argue that the laws of, or at least not the laws, but the application of the Sherman Antitrust should be applied to some of these oligopolies to break them up, to make entry more easier, and they can't use their power in the marketplace, which is damaging prices and quality, is the argument. But others would argue that a oligopoly often is advantageous because that scale can be used to the betterment of the marketplace. Nonetheless, we have a monopolistic competition with few but some oligopolies, and those can be used in combination to help our system run more efficiently, drive down price, and increase quality, which is, again, for the overall common good. An argument is for our system, because absent of that, we have the two extremes which simply don't work in application.